Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
So I've been finishing up a new video. It's called Facepalm. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's our users who have submitted video clips of themselves facepalming. You know, the hand right up to the face and bam, just a release of tension, just an expression of disbelief and shame over the insanity in the world. Facepalm. Well, we're sort of mixing those clips in with examples of facepalm-worthy headlines from all around the country and all around the world. Could be anything from, anything that's popped out of Pat Robertson's mouth to the Texas State Board of Education, to Sarah Palin, to the Creation Museum, whatever. And it's not going to change the world. This video is really more of sort of a cathartic release of tension, as we can all relate, and we can watch it and just nod our heads and say, yes, this is exactly how I feel. And by putting everything together, and it'll be from different religions and belief systems and different sort of levels of woo going on, I think hopefully it'll again draw a circle around how superstition can make otherwise rational people do crazy and irrational things. And so the facepalm video should release in the first week of February sometime. I'm putting the final touches on it. Something else I wanted to mention before we get started. I really enjoy being able to connect with the users of this community via social media, Facebook and Twitter. And a little bit of Google+. Very little of Google+, but it's there. But I am frustrated. Facebook is driving me crazy, and people always say, why would you criticize Facebook? It's free. Which is crazy. Why would a free service remain above analysis or criticism as far as whether or not it can be improved or whether it's working in the best interest of its users? Well, we have 160,000 people who have subscribed to the Thinking Atheist Facebook page, right? So if I post something, there's a new video coming up, post about that. Or we're doing a tour. The Unholy Trinity tour is coming up with me and Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ron. I want to get the word out about the 3 cities we're going to be at and post that on Facebook. Or there's a headline you want to find out about it. We're going to get details on the upcoming debate. Bill Nye, Ken Ham. Where do I watch it? What's going on? So I post that on Facebook. Well, a tiny percentage of people will actually see the post. Now, I realize that not everybody should be able to see everything at every time. The logistics of every post going out to everybody that's just impossible. I understand there's going to have to be some filtering and some algorithms in place that you sort of judge what goes out wherever. Fine, I get all that. What I don't like is the fact that 160,000 page users, there might be 10% who actually see a post, and then Facebook comes back and they want me to pay them upwards of what, $600, $800, $1,000 to promote my post? Hell no, I'm not going to pay them $1,000 to promote my post. I don't have $1,000 to promote it. On principle, I'm not going to pay it. You're not going to hold the content hostage. That doesn't work. So social media is going to remain as it always is. I'm going to continue to use it, fine. But as a solution, I have just started the Thinking Atheist email newsletter, and you can sign up right now on the homepage of thethinkingatheist.com. Now, the email is just going to be like once a week or so, just an update. Here's what's going on. Here's what's happening next week on the podcast. And here's my guest. And here's the email if you want to contribute to the show. Here's tour information. A new video is coming out. Here's what it's going to be. Get ready. Here's a piece of the news you might want to be interested in. You might want to check this out. Just sort of a short form way to communicate with people via email. And if that's interesting to you, it's totally free. And your email is safe. We're not going to sell it or give it to anybody else. It's just for for this community. But go to thethinkingatheist.com and you'll see a little bar there that says sign up for our email newsletter. So if you want to find out what's going and you want to make sure you're not going to miss it because Facebook decided you shouldn't see it yet, sign up to the newsletter and we'll see how that goes, okay? My guest tonight is Dr. Darrel Ray. He's the author of several books, including Sex and God and the God Virus, among others. He's written dozens of articles on subjects as broad as leadership in the secular community to secular sexuality. He is a psychologist. He's practiced clinical and organizational psychology for most of his career. In 2009, he founded Recovering from Religion, which is now an international organization. They have chapters in 5 countries. Recovering from Religion helps people get over the trauma of religious indoctrination. Sarah Moorhead's the executive director. Darrel's chairman of the board. In 2011, Darrel founded the Secular Therapist Project to help secularists find truly secular mental health services. And they have 165 registered therapists, and right now over 2,700 registered clients. Dr. Darrel Ray, thank you so much for joining me for the show tonight. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me on again, Seth. Good to be with you.
Can you give us just a quick biography, a quick look at where you came from and how you got where you are? I mean, you came from religion, right?
I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas, and that should be your first hint. And my parents became missionaries later in life. I went to church 3 to 5 times a week. I sang in the choir. I taught Sunday school. Even went to seminary at Scarrett College for Christian Workers. At the end of 2 years of getting this master's degree, I thought, I can't tell anybody else what to believe when I don't believe it myself. I didn't have a traumatic coming out. Religion did not traumatize me as I see it traumatize some other people. It did negatively affect me. And when I was becoming a clinical psychologist, when I got out of my seminary, I went back and got my doctorate in psychology, and that's where I started seeing the just tremendous damage that religion does to people.
It's funny. In my experience, when I was a believer in the church, there was this huge distrust of psychologists and psychology. And do you find that's the case even today?
Oh, it's actually institutionalized. Almost all fundamentalist religions are very wary of psychologists. Jehovah's Witnesses will disown you. They will disfellowship you if you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Scientology does too, of course, as we well know. But Baptists, other groups like that, the more fundamentalists see psychology as a direct threat to undermining the dogma that they're being taught. And many churches, especially more fundamentalist churches, believe that mental health comes from Jesus. You can get healthy. You can get over your depression by praying. And you're not praying hard enough, or you're not doing whatever you need to do for this God that can cure you of whatever disease you've got or mental illness. And so it really is an insidious downward spiral. You pray harder because you're depressed. Well, you're probably depressed because you're not doing enough for your God. The God condemns you even more, and you get more depressed. It's a really nasty, negative downward spiral. And it's just difficult for people to get out of if they're in those religions, because those religions say psychologists are going to tell you things that will undermine your faith, and don't go to them. Now, here's the problem, and it kind of ties into the Secular Therapy Project. Right now, there are more religious universities and colleges graduating graduates with graduate degrees, like master's and graduate degrees in marriage and family counseling, even in clinical psychology, than there are secular universities graduating those same degrees. Imagine you go to Pat Robertson's Regents University and you get a PhD in clinical psychology. Do you realize that 1 year of that PhD is required to be theology? Pat Robertson theology? It says hurricanes in Orlando came because of homosexuality. That's what PhD psychologists are being trained in at Pat Robertson's University. And this is not an exception. This is the rule within the religious universities. So there are a lot of people out there hanging their shingle up as therapists, even as full-blown psychologists and social workers, who've got that kind of mindset that Jesus is the answer, not traditional psychology, not good clinical skills and stuff like that.
It has to be a cyclical thing, right? I mean, you're told, lean on God or Jesus or whoever to find your joy. He will give you your joy. And then you continue to have problems. Depression, joylessness, some other sort of a struggle. You think it's your own lack of faith, and then you feel even more like you're damaged goods, right?
The most religious states in this nation have the highest numbers of mental illness as well as the highest numbers of divorce. The symptoms of mental illness are all over in religious communities, but there's no way to treat them. And the poor people get shuffled around from minister to youth minister to Sunday school teacher and to prayer meetings to Bible studies. Just go to another Bible study and that'll help you with your depression. Don't go to a psychologist, though.
Talking here with Dr. Darrel Ray. Help me out with some definitions real fast. The difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist.
Okay, good question. Well, there's really mainly three basic providers of mental health in our country. The psychologist is clinically trained and generally in a talk therapy kind of thing and don't usually prescribe drugs. They're a PhD. The psychiatrist is an MD. They may or may not be trained in talk therapy, but they do and can give drugs. It's a little bit of an overlap between the two, but you generally go to a psychiatrist to get medications for whatever mental illness you're experiencing, and you go to a psychologist to get talk therapy. And then the third provider are social workers, clinical social workers, and then there's kind of a fourth that may be a master's level marriage and family counselor, a bachelor's level counselor that's not a full psychologist but has good training in counseling.
Tonight's topic, of course, is religion and shame. Are we talking sexual shame? We talking about shame about your body, self-worth, maybe the shame of original sin? I mean, what are we talking about?
All the above, but it does start with original sin. If you think about the very first lesson in the Bible is Adam and Eve discovered they didn't have any clothes on and went and put something on. That's certainly body shame. It's certainly sexual shame. And, of course, according to St. Paul, it's evidence of original sin, too. It's kind of all three wrapped in one little story there. That's where it all starts. And what I've more recently kind of gotten deeply involved in writing articles and trying to publish some stuff on the notion of shame, because I don't think anybody's talking about shame. We talk about how religion damages people, and we talk about the crazy ideas that religion has. But as a psychologist, I want to talk about why does it work that way? How do we get under the hood of religion and really see how the gears all go together? And why does it make people behave the way it does? That's what's most interesting to me. I don't care whether there's a God or not. I don't want to debate somebody on that. I don't care whether Jesus existed or not. He probably didn't, as far as I know, but I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is, why is this religion, Christianity especially, so interested in our sex lives, telling us how damaged we are? But in order to understand all that, I think we need to define some terms. And so let's just think about, there's really two kinds of terms that we're talking about, guilt and shame. And they're two parts kind of the same thing. We could even think of them as being on a continuum. And we could put guilt over on the left-hand side and shame on the right-hand side. And certainly as you get towards the middle, there's overlap. But guilt is more incident-based. You can be guilty of robbing a bank. You can be guilty of forgetting to pick your kid up from school. Those are kinds of things that you can be guilty of. And you can ask for forgiveness. Maybe the government will forgive you. Maybe they won't for robbing that bank. Maybe your spouse will or won't forgive you for having forgotten to pick the kid up at school. But you can ask for forgiveness around guilt. It's based around a behavior you engaged in, generally speaking. Clear on the other end is shame. And shame is something that is just embedded into your very being. Shame is a component of your identity. And religious cultures try to teach you shame from the very beginning of your indoctrination into that culture, because shame really helps control you. And shame teaches the entire community how to treat you if you violate a taboo. It's almost always around taboos, but especially religious taboos. The religions teach the shame, and it's a part of your identity. As a Christian, you don't have sex before marriage. If you get caught masturbating, for example, you will feel deep shame. And the community itself, if it finds out, will shame you and ostracize you and set you aside from the community. And sometimes you can't get forgiveness for a shame-based violation. It can be so insidious that we see like honor killings in Iran or Iraq in Islam, because a girl kissed a boy or a girl wrote a love letter to a boyfriend. Now she's going to get her head chopped off or stoned to death, because that's how deep the shame is in those communities. And, oh, by the way, it's not much different in some Christian communities. And in the past, that's what happened to adulterous women. They got stoned to death. That's what shame does. It's so insidious. And it's communal. I think the big difference between guilt and shame is communal. you get sanctioned by the entire community for a shame-based violation. A guilt-based violation, you can stand up in front of the congregation and ask for forgiveness. They'll forgive you. Or you can go to your wife or husband. Shame's not like that. Shame goes to your very core. You will feel filthy. In fact, religions oftentimes use a disease model. If you engage in a shamed behavior, then you are diseased. And you have to be cut out like a diseased part of your body. You have to be cut out of the community so that the disease doesn't spread. And you see this in the Amish community, for example, someone that does a shameful thing like have an affair or get pregnant before marriage. They will shame that person right out of the community.
You know, it's interesting. I was a teenager attending a Baptist church, and I don't really remember what the sin was that had been committed. But somebody within the church, as part of the church membership, had done something. And they were confronted biblically about their sin, and they were brought up, literally brought up physically before the whole church congregation by the pastor to confess and ask for forgiveness, and they were placed on a kind of spiritual probation before the pastor and the deacons and the church family. And this would be a method of shaming someone to control them, yes?
No, I think that's exactly what it is. Now, there can be a guilt component to it, of course, but if you're being brought in front of the entire community, remember I said shame is communal, guilt is not necessarily. So if you're seeing the whole community involved in it, it's probably shame-based, it's not guilt-based.
It seemed normal at the time, you know, it seemed like the thing to do. Of course, now it seems like it's very cult-ish to bring somebody out and to call them out for behavior that is, quote unquote, unacceptable.
Well, actually, I think that's a measure of a cult. The more shame-based religion is, the more cultish it probably is. And almost all cults start out with a high degree of shame in their founding. And it doesn't matter whether it's Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, Christianity, all of them started out and continue to have lots of shame in them. But the more cultish aspects of them are shame-based. Now, the problem is in Saudi Arabia, you can have a very shame-based religion like Islam, and it works beautifully. You can just intimidate people, all over the place and just toe in the party line. Because there is no choice. You can't say, well, I think today I'm going to try being a Baptist, or maybe I want to be an atheist. Now, you'll get your head chopped off if you do that. The shame community there is powerful. When you get into a pluralistic society like the United States or Europe or other places where there's choices, then it's harder to control congregations with shame. And I've seen this in U.S. Protestantism. Protestant has gone from being more shame-based to much more guilt-based. If you can get enough people to feel guilty about something, you can still control them, not nearly as well, but you can still control them.
They tell you you're diseased, and then they sell you the cure.
Exactly. U.S. Protestantism has mastered the art of guiltifying people and getting people to feel guilty. So now you can get them to give money and come to church and spend their time with that particular congregation. And it's not as cultish because you don't get this, there's Baptist churches don't bring people up front and shame them anymore, or not very many of them do that anymore. But the Jehovah's Witnesses still do. In fact, if you are brought in front of the elders of the church, it takes two elders, I believe I get this right, two elders to accuse you and examine you, and then to get forgiveness, you have to go before another group of three elders. Now, one of the questions they're going to ask you is, who else do you know is sinning in this congregation? And they will actually say, you really can't get forgiven unless you're ratting on your cohorts in crime. That is clearly a cult.
It really kind of sounds like a prison of paranoia. You're always looking over your shoulder because somebody's always watching.
It is, but that's Jehovah's Witnesses. It's also Scientologists, and it's also, to a large degree, Mormons. Mormons behave that way, too.
This type of shaming by religion, by the church, it often scars people in a significant way. Now, you're a psychologist. You've undoubtedly seen firsthand examples of people who've had their own self-worth damaged by this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's especially damaging to sexuality. I mean, how many Mormon boys, gay Mormon boys, have been thrown out of their homes? And right now, the largest number of people that are homeless in Salt Lake City are gay boys. 16, 15-year-old boys have been thrown out of their homes because of shame. But it's shame of the parents. The parents are ashamed based upon their religious ideas about what homosexuality is. So the shame puts that poor boy out on the street, and in some cases girls too, and those people are ostracized from the community. They're also ostracized from their own sexuality because they're out there on the street, or no matter where they are, they're carrying with them that Mormon shame that they learned from the day they were born. And it's insidious in the way people learn shame, especially sexual shame, because it starts almost from the day you leave the womb. I may have told this story to you before, but I watched my grandmother. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I watched my grandmother while she was changing my little brother's diapers. Now, my grandmother was super, super fundamentalist religious. In fact, she was crazy and mentally ill in many ways. I loved her, but she had some strangeness about her on the religion front. But as I was watching her, my little brother, who's probably no more than 6 months old, reaches down and touches his penis, and she slaps his hand away. Now, that is religious shaming behavior on her part. I doubt if my brother remembered it, but I sure did. And that lesson went straight inside me. Wow, you touch yourself, it's wrong. Why would she slap my brother's hand away? It was a violent move on her part.
There's a church in my hometown that had a program for what they called masturbation buddies. And what they would do is they would say, if you ever have the urge to self-gratify, you are to pick up the phone and call your masturbation buddy so that they can talk you out of this moment of temptation and sin. Well, how creepy is that? The idea of people calling, look, I've got this desire, and I want you to pray with me here on the telephone. And I guess when they made the announcement, a few of the guys in the auditorium just got up and walked right out.
Good for them. Good for them. Well, I don't know if you've seen that insidious Mormon video that's been going around. It's a rather recent, well-produced video on if you know your friend is addicted to porn, or if you know your friend is masturbating, you owe it to him to turn him into the authorities. And it's put out by Brigham Young University. Now, that goes right back to what we were talking about earlier. In a cult, you are required to turn other people in for sinning. They're actually telling college-age kids, if you know your friend's masturbating, if you know your friend's looking at porn, you should turn them into the elder, and then it shows how happy everybody is once he's been turned in and once he's had a good talking to by the bishop. And, oh, by the way, that's what bishops do in the Mormon church, is they counsel people about their sex and sexuality. Mitt Romney was a bishop in the Mormon church. One of his jobs was to sit down with 12-year-old boys and hand them a piece of paper. The title of this paper was "Don't Tamper with the Factory." And it's simple. Yeah, I know. It's hilarious, isn't it? There's 4 pages in this pamphlet. They never once mention a sexual organ. They never once mention masturbation. They never once mention sex. But you understand, your body is like a factory, and it produces little things, and it wants to ejaculate those little things, and you have to be aware that God's going to take care of that, and you don't need to touch it.
Well, I'm still stuck at the beginning of the conversation. I was thinking, talking to the bishop is probably what got these young kids into trouble to begin with. Well, look, this is a perfect segue because I had an email in from Thomas, and Thomas had a question on the issue of porn. He said, look, I want to know what Darrel's opinion is on the studies that have been done regarding, quote, porn addiction and some of the treatment methods that are being used, such as complete sexual deprivation. I'm curious what might cause one to be, quote, addicted to pornography, as my own usage of porn seemed to decrease quite a bit when it became acceptable for me to use it instead of being off limits. Is there a forbidden fruit aspect in play here, or is porn addiction a real thing? There's probably 3 or 4 questions layered in there, but did you want to address this subject?
I absolutely do. Is it okay if I use a 4-letter word every now and then?
You can say whatever you want. We're all adults here.
I knew that. I just wanted to make sure the audience was warned, and I probably will.
Got it.
Your emailer there is right on target. This whole idea of sex addiction, this whole idea of porn addiction, both, no matter what you call it, is simply bullshit. First of all, there is no DSM-5 category within the psychological, psychiatric world classified as sex addiction. The American Psychiatric Association does not have a classification like that. The people who like to classify that as something, a sexual addiction, are religious people. They love it because it brings you back to Jesus. There is nothing about viewing pornography or masturbating or, quote, having lots of sex that's addictive. You can't get addictive to your own body. Now, that all said, if somebody is missing appointments because they're masturbating too much, or something like that, that's a problem. But it's not the masturbation that's the problem. It's a symptom. When people are depressed, they self-medicate. And one of the ways to self-medicate is through sexuality. So my advice to anyone who, quote, thinks they are sexually addicted or addicted to pornography is just look at it as a symptom of something deeper. And it's oftentimes, more often than not, a symptom that you're depressed. And once you deal with the depression, you can move on. And you still will masturbate because human beings masturbate. I studied with the great psychotherapist Albert Ellis back in the 70s, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century. And he had a famous saying. He said 97% of men admit to masturbating and the other 3% are lying. And that's probably close to accurate. Not as accurate for women. We know that women probably masturbate about 80% of the time. 80% of women masturbate. And maybe not as much. But the fact is that that's what we do. Chimpanzees do it. Bonobos do it. Lots and lots of primates self-satisfy. There's nothing wrong with it. And you can't do it too much. Your body, if you do it too much, your body will object and say, nope, we're not doing that again.
Talking here with Dr. Darrel Ray. All right, so you're in a committed relationship with someone, and you are using pornography, and you're not using it together. Let's say someone finds a spouse and, hey, you've got porn here, and they feel betrayed. They think you're perverted. They think you're all these types of things. This is common, by the way, in the church. It's like a worst case scenario, right? Can you speak to me about pornography in that context, in the context of a committed relationship?
Sure. Well, first of all, you're not a pervert. Lots and lots of married people, male and females, use pornography because a lot of times the sexual relationship, in a committed relationship, you can't possibly satisfy the other person. The other person's got a higher sex drive than you do, or they've got an interest you're not interested in. There's all sorts of reasons why a person might want to masturbate and not participate with a partner. Now, that said, if you are using porn, enjoying porn, there's nothing wrong with enjoying porn, nothing wrong with masturbating to porn. What happens is if that takes the place of the relationship, if you can no longer relate to your spouse, and it goes either way, it's not just men or women, it's either one. If you can't relate to your spouse or don't have sexual energy left because you masturbated too much, whatever that might be, then that's a problem because you're interfering with your relationship. But once again, it's not the porn. It's not the masturbation that's the problem. You've got to ask a question. What's the nature of the relationship? I had a fellow come to me a couple of years ago, and he said, I think I've got erectile dysfunction. I can't get an erection with my wife. And I say, wow, okay, well, let's talk about this. He says, I've tried Viagra and I tried Cialis. I can't get an erection with my wife. So I only asked one question to diagnose this. It was a very simple diagnosis. I say, can you get an erection when you masturbate? He says, oh, yeah, I can get an erection then. Okay, then let's look at the relationship. We now know you can get an erection. So that's not the problem. You do not have erectile dysfunction if you can get an erection while masturbating. You have relationship dysfunction if you can't get an erection with your spouse, with your partner, with your lover, whoever. And that's where you should be looking. So it took me about 5 more minutes to find out he is really turned off by his wife. And she's done a lot of things to him sexually that just turns him off. And so does that lead to stopping porn? Does that lead to stopping masturbation? No, it leads to bringing your spouse in and let's talk about what's causing this and whether you want to continue in this relationship or not. That's the real issue. Don't get focused on the symptom. Get focused on the underlying cause of that.
The church often says that it celebrates sex and sexuality, right? This is God's gift, a consecrated union between a man and a woman, a husband and wife, specifically a God-ordained definition of sex. But the guidelines are pretty narrow, and the church is very quick to pass judgment about practices or preferences or positions or whatever that it considers to be lust instead of love, right? They're ready to brand non-Christian sex as something perverse.
Absolutely. And what religions have found, it's not just Christianity, but Christianity's done quite a good job, is if you can control someone's sexuality, you can really control them. I don't quote Richard Nixon very often, but Richard Nixon had a famous saying. He says, once you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. And that's really what we're talking about. If you can get people's sexuality captured by the church, then they will spend a lot of time feeling guilty about something that's perfectly normal. And I keep hearing from you as you're talking that you use the word perverted. You know, the definition of pervert is somebody who's getting better sex than you are. That's my definition of a pervert.
Hang on, I'm writing that down. Hang on. Definition of a pervert. All right. Got it. Thanks, Dr. Ray. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So if somebody's getting better sex than you are, they're probably a pervert. And that's the way religions look at it. They put all these rules up, and then if you violate the rule, you're the pervert. But the problem is what you do is perfectly natural and normal. How you express your sexuality is your business. It's not any church's business. It's not any minister. It's not your Sunday school teacher. And if your Sunday school teacher isn't getting laid, that's not your problem. She needs to go, or he needs to go take care of that and stop condemning you for it. But that's not the way churches operate.
I heard it said once that guys think about sex at least once an hour. I don't know. Have you heard that kind of thing flying around? People say, men, they think about sex at least once an hour. Do you know anything about this statistic? And what's the stat for females? I'm just curious.
Oh, not much different. Women think about sex a lot. Whether they think about it as much as men or not is clearly debatable. I don't think women think about it as much in our culture. But here's an interesting thing. It's culturally specific because women oftentimes, in some cultures, women are the initiators of sex. In some cultures, women control the entire sexual relationship. In the Manganian culture in the South Pacific, women are voracious, and their rule of that particular culture that's been there for hundreds of years, long before Western contact came to that particular island, the rule was a girl could have as many boyfriends as she wants. There's hardly any taboos around sexuality there. Even for young kids, can have sex anytime they want. But the thing that the rule was, the boy is expected to give the girl at least 3 orgasms for every 1 orgasm that he has. Now, who's thinking about sex more here? It looks to me like the gal's getting a heck of a lot. Or we could talk about the Na culture in China, which is, we know it's very old because Marco Polo visited this culture. And it's a culture where women are in charge. And there's not even a word for father. There's not a word for husband because they don't have marriage in this culture. It doesn't exist there. The girl gets to be 12, 13 years old when she has her first menstrual cycle. She is given her own room with an outdoor entrance. And she can invite anybody she wants into her room. And there's no marriage. So she may hook up with a guy. She may hook up with more than one guy. But the guy comes into her room. They engage in whatever sex they want to engage in. The only rule, and it's a hard and fast rule, is the man has to be out before breakfast. The men cannot live with their lovers, so they have to go back and forth. And the fathers in this society, the Na culture, or another word for it is the Muoso, the rule of thumb in this culture is that the uncles are the male figures. The uncles live in the house with the mother, and so you don't need a father.
I'm just thinking about a culture that encourages them to love you and leave you, right? Make sure he's gone before breakfast.
Yeah, right.
Look, I'm going to come back in just a second to the subject of sex and teenagers, specifically young teens, because I know it's something that a lot of parents are curious about. But I must do due diligence here and finally get to the switchboard. Are you up for taking a few calls, Dr. Ray?
Go for it.
All right, let's do it. I've got area code 207. Thank you for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast with Dr. Darrel Ray. Who's this?
My name is Chris. How you doing, Seth? I've been a huge fan for about 3 weeks. I've been mainlining your podcasts for
Go easy. Pace yourself, brother. Pace yourself. No, thanks for listening. It means a lot. Means a lot. Well, you're on the air with Dr. Darrel Ray. Do you have a comment or question tonight?
Most definitely. I grew up as a fundamentalist Christian. I turned atheist roughly. It was one of those gradual turnings where you're like, man, I believe in the Bible. I'm like, well, wait a second. Noah's Ark doesn't make any sense. And then it kind of just fell away. I only actually came out as atheist last year. But my whole thing with shame and sexuality was, when I was growing up, my father caught me masturbating at one point. And my father was a very, very religious person. And the other part of my story is that I'm also a transgender. I'm a out transgender, bisexual crossdresser. And that was a whole nother slew. And my dad said, well, your Bible says you can't, if a man dresses in the clothes of a woman or a woman dresses in the clothes of a man, they're an abomination. And I'm like, well, people do it all the time, and that was another thing that took me a long time to get over, that this was something that I feel more comfortable in women's clothing than I do in men's clothing.
Chris, congratulations, because you've climbed a big mountain there. That's tough to get out, that kind of thing.
I find it is. There's such a stigma against it.
Well, and it's a well-designed stigma, because if it makes you feel ashamed of your own body, it makes you feel ashamed of your own desires, the only way you can get away from that shame is to go back to church and pray, confess your sins, read the Bible, go to Sunday school. It brings you back to Jesus. That's what it's designed to do.
I think that the gradual falling away from religion helped me come to terms with all that. It's funny. Last year I came out on the same day as an atheist and a bisexual crossdresser, and more of my friends were shocked that I was an atheist. You're an atheist? They had no problem with me being a crossdresser and being transgender, but, oh my God, you're atheist?
Yeah, I have heard so many people say that, Chris. It was harder to come out as an atheist as it was to come out as almost anything else.
I appreciate your perspective and your story, and thanks for being a part of the show. It means a lot. Take care of yourself, all right?
Thanks, you, Seth. Thank you for everything you do. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Take care. It's funny when people pull something like that out of Scripture. I always do something like, the Bible says not to have long hair, and then you sort of reach up and point at the long-haired Jesus oil painting that's standing on Do not have a tattoo, and then you point to the tattoo of some scripture on their bicep. It's just one of those moments that's just priceless. Area code 310, you're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Thanks for waiting. Who's this?
This is Gene.
Gene, thanks for waiting. Thanks for calling. You're on the air with Dr. Darrel Ray. What do you have for us tonight?
Wow. Okay, just real quick, Seth, thank you for your show. I've been listening for the last few months now.
Thank you.
And just to give kind of a background, I was converted as a Christian back in 1990. I was 20 years old, and I've been part of it now for about 20-something years now. But I've really been kind of gravitating away from Christianity in the last year or so. I was part of a very fundamentalist church early on. I was very hardline, very strict about masturbation, about sex, and they kind of have a structured system of, like, obviously going to date women in your church or date within your church. And maybe with all best intentions, they really put a lot of control and a lot of monitoring of how singles interacted in the church. They were very hell-bent on keeping people from not having sex in the fellowship. Met a girl, not part of the church, really liked her. And people knew that I liked her, but I really tried to stay open, quote unquote, be open about, like, my desire for her and that kind of thing. Long story short, we hooked up 4 years later, got with the singles leader, and it was a really ugly situation where he basically said I totally used her, that kind of thing. I told him to go fuck himself. Didn't say that, but that was pretty much my tone. And he turned around at me and said, you deserve hell for what you did. And he said to me like 3 times, no, and that was a turning point for me.
Does anybody within earshot honestly think that those people in your church weren't doing somebody? You know what I'm saying? The more they preach out about sex, about sort of this Puritan view of sex, the more I am convinced that somebody's doing something somewhere, probably right around the corner, probably in the baptistry. I mean, Dr. Ray, have you seen that people are preaching out against the stuff they're probably doing themselves?
I think there's a lot of evidence to put that. I mean, everywhere from Jimmy Swaggart to Ted Haggard, you see it in the main leaders. I would like to go back to, Gene, what you said earlier. What you were in sounds to me like a cult. I mean, if they're really controlling you that much.
Early on, it was a cult. I mean, it was a very well-known Christian church at the time. It's not so much that way now. They were like that. It was part of the Boston movement.
When I hear about churches like this and that kind of behavior within a church, obviously I don't believe there's such a thing as a hell. There's no heaven. There's no God, that kind of stuff. So if you subtract that out, then you got to ask the question, what is the function of that level of control? What does that control do? It has to have a positive function. I'm in anthropology, psychology, they'd call me a functionalist. I'm always looking for the real reason something happens. What's the real motivation for this behavior? The real motivation is it keeps you coming back to the church. And the more successful they are at injecting shame and guilt into you, they're giving you the disease. As long as they've got a syringe there and they're just injecting guilt and shame, then they could say, now you come back next week and we'll help you get over this guilt and shame that we just gave you. It's a vicious cycle. I call it the guilt cycle. In my book, The God Virus, I explore it. I say, here's what the guilt cycle is. It's a method of getting you to believe that you are worthless and the only way you can be worthwhile is to come back here. You got into that game, and unfortunately, at the age of 20 years old, you want to be sexually active. Your body's hormones are going crazy, and it's time for you to find somebody in terms of just the way our species works. And here this church is saying, no, you can't do that, except, like Seth said, within some very really, really restrictive rules. You're going to rebel against it. Your body's going to rebel. Your mind's going to rebel against it. And then you're going to feel guilty as hell, and you're going to come back to church. So it's not got anything to do with hell. It has everything to do with keeping you infected so you'll give more money and more time and convert other people, especially children. Because the real goal of the church is to get you to get married to the right person within the church, have children, and infect them too.
Thank you, Gene, for the call. Greatly appreciated, man. Thanks for being a part of the show.
Thank you.
I want to talk for a second about young people and sex, young teenagers. Now, we've talked about this in the past, and I want to bring it up again. The age of sexual maturity contrasted with the average age that most people get married. And this span of time in the middle is this big window for what the church calls adultery. Now, can you kind of spell that out for us? I mean, what's the median age for sexual maturity?
Well, it actually changes, and it changes almost by culture. It's kind of funny. There's some cultures where boys and girls mature earlier. Other cultures, they mature later. We're seeing a strong lowering of sexual maturity in some aspects of our own cultures. Girls are becoming sexually mature earlier than they were not too many years ago. We think it may be related to environmental things like chemicals in our diets or whatever. The other side of the coin is we're also seeing some evidence that boys are maturing maybe later. So you get this issue that girls mature earlier, boys maybe later, and that seems to be true about everywhere of our species. But the hormones are flowing rapidly, and they're wanting to have sex no matter when. I mean, that's just what happens. I remember when I was 13, I was desperate.
So what's the average age for marriage here in the United States? I mean, are they waiting to their upper 20s, or do we have a number on that?
25, 26 is where it's at right about now.
So we're talking about between 13 and 26. That's 13 plus years, where if you have sex, you have just violated God's sacred law and his trust, right?
Exactly. The difference is that in times past, people got married much younger. I mean, even in my lifetime, I got married when I was 20, and I had friends that were getting married at 19 and 18, and nobody thought a thing of it. You graduate from high school, you get married.
Okay, well, look, I've got a teenage girl in the house, and I'm thinking to myself, my instinct is to wrap a fence around her. Barbed wire and brick, and put machine gun turrets on the top. I just want to protect her from the world. But at the same time, living in the real world, you know that this is a very natural thing. And how does one address a teenager in the home when it comes to the issue of sex? The majority of high schoolers are not virgins, correct?
Yeah. Well over 50% of high schoolers have had penetrative sex by the time they're graduated. Well over 50.
How do you handle the topic of a sexually active or potentially a sexually active teenager in the home when you're dealing with parents and their kids? How do you handle that?
Well, I asked the question a little differently. How do you deal with kids when you want to talk to them and deal with them around alcohol or smoking? How do you do that? They're the same kinds of conversations. Sex is no more dangerous than driving a car. If you simply follow the rules, simple rules we've got in driving a car, you have a reasonable expectation of being safe, going to and from work, going to and from the grocery store. Sex is no more dangerous than driving a car. You can get killed in a car. You can get killed or hurt in a car even when you're following all the rules. Sex is the same way. So treat sex in that way. It's not dangerous. It's nothing to be shameful about. And, oh, by the way, parents are perfectly capable of talking to their kids about sex and the consequences and how to deal with those consequences or how to avoid the consequences, condoms, birth control. When my daughter was 13, 14 years old, we read books together. There's some really good books out there. I used Pomeroy's book, Sex and Girls, and he's got another book called Sex and Boys. I just simply sat down and read the books with him, and we had question and answer period. Probably took us several weeks to go through it. My kids did not want to do that at first. They were resistant. But I'm not going to let them go out in this cold, cruel world. I'm not going to put my child behind a car with no lessons. When my daughter or my son started driving or wanted to start driving, I was in the car with them. I sat right next to them. I said, here's what you do. Here's how you do it. Let's practice. Well, you do kind of the same way. Obviously, I'm not going to practice with my son or daughter, but I am going to be with them. And what I see is so many parents just turn their kids loose and hope that the sex education they get at school or hope the book they threw under their nose is going to do the job. It's not. It's not going to do the job any more than giving them the keys to the car and say, go learn how to drive is going to do the job. You're going to get a damaged car in that situation, and you're going to get a damaged kid. Somebody's going to get pregnant. Somebody's going to get disease. So if you sit down and talk to kids openly, I think there's some real important things to consider. How do you feel about your own sexuality as a parent? For example, can you admit that you had sex? You know, I had 5 sex partners before I got married. Can you talk openly about that to your kid? You don't have to be detailed. I'm not saying you give them all the details. But if you can't admit that you were sexual as a teenager, or that you started masturbating when you were 13 years old, and there's nothing wrong with it, if you can't talk out loud about this, then you're dealing with your own shame messages. And that's part of why we're talking here tonight is parents, secular parents, need to get over their own shame. And when they do, they can be much more kind, considerate, knowledgeable, open with their children. If you have trouble talking to your children about sex, it's probably because you yourself haven't dealt with the shame that you learned as a teenager, as a young adult. So.
Here in the age of information, it's hugely unlikely that they probably aren't speaking the language of sexuality anyway, at least internally, right? I mean, there are probably very few things they haven't already seen or heard about, correct?
Absolutely. They've heard of it all. You're not informing them. That's not what your job is because they've already got all the information. All they did was tune into the internet one night and they got all the basics. What your job is to help them understand the values of respect for other people, for other people's bodies, for your own body, and that it's okay to experiment, but it needs to be done in a way that respects all concerned. And there is no shame in having sex early. There's no shame in having sexual desires. There's no shame in wanting to masturbate or look at pornography. As the very first email that you read, something about, is there shame in looking at pornography? And I had a thought about that. I wanted to.
Yeah, he was speaking specifically about what he called the addiction to porn. Can I be addicted to pornography?
And what he said that was once he accepted it, then the desire went down. He didn't look at porn as much. And I've heard this so many times in my career that once I got rid of religion, once I got rid of the guilt around my sexuality, I didn't masturbate as much. I didn't use porn as much. They never say they stopped using porn or they'd stopped masturbating, but they didn't feel the need. And what happens, I have a saying I use in my sessions. I say guilt drives behavior. And that's a very important thing to think about. If you feel guilty about, let's say you're a smoker and you want to quit smoking. You go 4 days without smoking and then you break down and you have a cigarette. Well, you usually don't break down and have a cigarette. You have a whole pack of cigarettes. You feel guilty then and you keep smoking. You know, I've got to get over the guilt of smoking by smoking another cigarette. And you see that in alcoholism as well. People, I feel guilty about going on a binge last week, so I've got to stop. I stop for a few days, and then I go on another binge to get over the guilt for having gone on the binge last week. Guilt tends to drive behavior, and it does it in sex as well. I felt guilty about masturbating last night, so now I've got to masturbate tonight to get over the guilt I experienced last night. And you really do, because these things feel good. Smoking a cigarette feels good. Having alcohol feels good. Masturbating feels good. And self-medication, you're medicating, but in this case, with religion, you're medicating the guilt that religion gave you in the first place. To get rid of the guilt, you're still going to masturbate. You're just not going to have to masturbate as much or feel the urge as much or feel guilty about it, so you do it more. That's what's going on.
You realize that this is like learning a foreign language. You know, for those of us who came out of the church, the idea of speaking almost casually about the idea of a, let's call it 13-year-old child who is encouraged to responsibly be sexual. Is that an accurate way to say it? I mean, to say, look, you're sexually mature. We're going to give you the tools. We're going to make sure that you're on birth control. We're going to teach you how to be safe.
The conversation should start much earlier than that. There are really good books written for 5, 6, 7-year-olds that help children learn about their bodies. You know, if you're waiting until 13, it's too late. I'm not going to discourage your listeners from doing it with their 13-year-old children, but I really would encourage them to make sure that they've started much earlier than that. And it's an ongoing conversation. It should be happening on a regular basis. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you get doing it, and the more comfortable they get doing it. For example, you might sit down and watch a movie together, and the movie's got some sexual innuendo or some scene that's got sexual stuff in it. That's a great opportunity to say, how do you feel about the way that relationship came together? What do you think of them having sex in the closet? Did that seem like the right thing for them to do at the time? And don't put any judgment on it. Just ask the kid. Let them tell you what they think.
You're talking about setting a tone from day one. So that when the time comes to have the quote unquote the talk, the one about contraception, the one about being safe out there, the one about sexual activity, that there's already a tone of comfort and acceptance and love and security already in place, so they feel they can have that dialogue with you. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely. And you will have that dialogue many times. Don't do it once. Don't sit down and let's have, quote, the talk. That's not the way to do it. You're going to have many talks. And they may be many talks, M-I-N-I. It may be a 30-second talk today. It may be a 5-hour talk tomorrow. It kind of depends. You know, when your daughter comes in and she's all upset because her boyfriend dumped her, that's an opportunity to have, quote, the talk. But you're not just talking about genitals and penetrative sex. You're talking about values. You're talking about relationships. You're talking about, wow, it hurts when somebody treats you like that. How do you think you should be treated? How do you want to treat other people? Ultimately, that'll lead to, you know, he wanted to have sex with me and I wasn't ready. Okay, that's good. I'm proud of you. You have the right to decide when you want to have sex. So that's what will come out in those kind of discussions, is she got dumped by her boyfriend because she wouldn't have sex with him yet. And that leads to a rich conversation. Well, when do you feel like you should have sex? What do you think? And she said, well, not with him because he dumped me. You know, I mean, I'm talking about conversations I've actually heard and seen or participated in. And they can just be wonderfully rich. I want to broaden your listeners' thought processes about what, quote, the talk is. The talk is a constant dialogue that may or may not involve genitals, may not talk about condoms. It may not talk about birth control. It talks about how do you develop relationships? How do you respect other people? How do you ask other people what they like, what they want? How do you interact with people that you're attracted to? I mean, there's just all sorts of opportunities to expand this conversation.
Is it best if, like, the male parent is addressing it with a male child, female parent to female child, or do genders matter in this regard?
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. There are cultural solutions that I've seen. For example, in the Mancunian culture I talked about earlier, and in the Iroquois culture, obviously before Western contact, it was the job of the aunt in the family to sexually educate the children. So the aunt is the prime giver of sexual information to the children. And that was literally the aunt's role in those two cultures. And it's actually true in other cultures. In some cultures, it's the male's job to educate the males and females to the females. I don't think it matters. What I think is it's who's comfortable with doing it. In my family, I was married for 18 years to a wonderful woman. We've got 2 great kids. So we're divorced, but we're still good friends. And we both took an opportunity. She was a teacher. She worked with kids. I was a psychologist. I worked with kids. So, you know, we had some training around this, but we kind of did a tag team with our 2 kids. And we'd see that maybe my daughter was more receptive to talking to me and my son was more receptive to talking to her, or maybe next week it reversed. We just kind of tag teamed it. And We then told I would tell her I had a talk with my son today, and we had some interesting things to say about, a girlfriend he's got now or something. And so I kept her informed of what the dialogue was. And I think keep your partner informed of what you're doing, and don't dump it on one if you can avoid it. I mean, if one partner just cannot talk about sex because they're so guiltified or shamed about it, that's a problem, but you don't want to dump that problem on the kid. So if one partner I can't talk to him about it because I feel so ashamed myself, then maybe that partner ought to go get some help, go to find a therapist and get over it. But they're not the one to be talking to the kid, because they're going to communicate that shame to the kid. Yeah. And you're not trying to perpetuate this insidious infection of religious shame. You're trying to get over it.
Talking here with Dr. Darrel Ray, it's been such a rich conversation, the clock's sort of gotten away from me. If there was a blog, an article, a book, a resource, some place for our listeners to go to be able to sort of go deeper into this particular subject, how to overcome shame, healthy sexuality, all those types of things, are there some resources you would recommend? And you can plug your own books here if you want, but just I want to send our people to a specific place or places where they might be able to find out more.
Yeah. Well, two things. Big reason I wrote Sex and God is for the very reason we're talking here tonight. So I'd say start with Sex and God. I think Dr. Marty Klein's book is a good book, too. It's called Sexual Intelligence. He's got some good stuff in that book. Our research on sex and sexuality that's available as a free download at ipcpress.com. It has some real interesting things I think your listeners would find useful. We asked 14,000 people about their sex lives, atheist people mostly. But they told us when they left religion, things really changed for the better. So those are three things. I'm also looking to publish a couple articles in the near future on this very subject that we're talking about, but they're not published yet, especially on the issue of male shame, which I would love to come back and talk about when that article's published, probably. I think it's an area that nobody's talking about right now.
We've got a second. Do you want to sort of synopsize it, or we want to wait a few months until it officially releases?
No, I would like to get the idea out. I think male shame is, we hear about female shame, but what I'm suggesting is there's two sides to the coin. Men are taught shame too. I was taught shame in 8th grade gym class when I'd go in the locker room and people would say, if you shake it 3 times, you're playing with it, or you must be a homo. So males are being shamed for their bodies. There's lots of male body shame that boys get. And what I try to explore in there in this article, and actually I explore it in Sex and God too, but not nearly as deeply, is that when boys are shamed, they're shamed with things like, you have to be the man of the house, and if you're not, you're a wimp, or you're a wuss, or you're a homo. So they shame people with sexual notions. And then what happens is boys grow up thinking, I must control the women in my life, because that's a Christian thing. The man is the head of the household. A man in church that doesn't control his women is not following God's word. So there's lots of incentive there to control the women. Well, how do you control women? You shame women. Why would you shame women? Because you do not want to be shamed. In many cultures, men were shamed because they weren't brave enough on the battlefield. Women are shamed for their sexuality. But the two are linked. Man that comes back from the battlefield and doesn't control his wife or his daughters is himself going to be shamed by the community, because the upright Christian controls his daughters and controls his wife. So you see, these two things go together. Men abuse women. Men shame women because they themselves don't want to be shamed by other men. And you see it in the locker rooms. You see it in football right now. There are gay guys playing football right now, but they don't dare come out because they will be shamed right off the team. We actually had an example of that with the bullying thing that came out with the Miami Dolphins recently. Now, that wasn't specifically around sexuality, but that's what could happen to a gay person.
When the writing comes out, whenever your published papers or blogs or what have you released, make sure and shoot those my direction, and I will get them out on our Facebook page, and we'll put them in the newsletter and make sure that people can find those resources. I think it's a great conversation to have. It's a liberating conversation to have, to be able to talk about the taboo. We always say, find the thing that the church doesn't want you to talk about. Find the question that the church definitely does not want you to ask, and then let's talk about that. Above all else, let's make sure that those are the things that get addressed. And so if we're going down that way, I think it's a monumental opportunity for us to have the conversation. So when it comes out, shoot me the links and I'll get it out. And I will link to your books, Sex and God and the God Virus, in the description box of this show. So people can just link directly to it. Support this man and his amazing work. And if you ever get a chance to see him speak, Darrel, you are such a good communicator. I mean, in a movement that needs communicators and storytellers, you go out and win the audience over. You speak to them on their level. You make them laugh. You make them feel like they know you. And everywhere I go, when I mention your name, people just start smiling like an idiot. So thank you for everything you do, man. You are amazing.
Well,
you're amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Seth.
Dr. Darrel Ray, and we'll hope to have you back on the show maybe later on this year. Does that work?
That works.
Thanks so much for your time and for being such a great part of the show. Join us on Tuesday of next week as we finally bust out of the borders of the United States. So many people have said, you're always talking about the USA and religion. Fine, we're talking about religion and atheism around the world. So if you live outside of these borders and you want to talk about non-belief and religion in your culture and sort of paint that picture, send an email for next week's show to podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. And we'll see you then.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.